Well, last time I shared the first rule, or principle, you could say, of faith that seeks, and that was to keep curiosity and faith together. And I looked at certain ways that doing so can lead to some interesting possibilities, whereas if we kind of separate the two, we perhaps miss out on some things. The second rule is very much connected to that one. Because if we don't keep curiosity and faith together, what I would argue is we often end up judging ideas a little bit prematurely, and we end up judging people. So the second rule is judge not, and that is because our ideas are inseparably tied to people. Now we can try to separate that, and I think we should as much as we can, but inevitably we think things, we feel passionately about them, and we can end up judging people. But if we let go of judgment, and if we hold on to curiosity and faith, I would argue, then we can get to a better place where we're able to achieve better possibilities. So that's why I go here with the second rule. As I illustrate this, and just like I did last time, illustrated that first rule, I'm going to illustrate with a few things that should be helpful. And I want to start with Bart Ehrman. Ehrman, if you remember from the last time, I talked about him, and if you didn't catch the last episode, basically Ehrman had this conversion experience as a young person, and this was built on, I would say, a pretty precarious foundation. The Bible had to be inerrant in just all these ways, and so things like the fact that all scholars recognize that there's many different manuscripts of the New Testament and we don't actually have the originals, things like that really started to bother him, and he started to look at like differences in the Gospels, and he's like, oh man, there's contradictions here, and so he just sort of started pulling these threads, and he was left with just a big clump of nothing when he got through. And Ehrman basically, he wrote some best-selling books and still writes some bestsellers, and he takes the approach of controversy, and this is not controversial to say. He has this way of sort of saying, here's what these people believe over here, and here's how ridiculous it is. I remember hearing him talk about the arrogance of evangelical Christians, for instance, and how it's hard to see it when you're in it, but once you get out, it's very easy to see. Now, I just want to take a step back and, again, explore this with curiosity and not, rush to judgment. But what I think I see going on here is that he came from a group of people who were, in their own way, a little judgmental. Whether they meant it or not, it was like, okay, here's the fundamentals of what we believe, and you've got to believe this. And it was kind of controlling, and so he got out of that, and he kind of, fires right back. So Ehrman ends up, at some point, he goes on the Stephen Colbert show, and Stephen Colbert is a Catholic, and he's pretty forthcoming about that. And so my friend shows me this video clip of Ehrman going on the Stephen Colbert show, and this has been a long time ago now. But Colbert has Ehrman on the show, and Colbert basically took the approach of, okay, Ehrman, you can dish it, but can you take it? So he has him on the show, and Colbert immediately just says, okay, so you've written this best-selling book, so tell me why I'm an idiot for believing that Jesus is God. Now, as you can see, Colbert has kind of taken this tactic of like, I'm going to immediately put you on the spot, and I'm going to immediately call you out for essentially how, hurtful you're being toward people like me who are intelligent, competent, believing people. And so Ehrman tries to use a little bit of humor, but now he's kind of on Colbert's turf. Colbert's good at this, Ehrman's not, so it doesn't go too well. And he said something to the effect of, well, the Gospels sort of disagree. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's not divine, which is highly debatable. But then in John, Jesus says to his disciples, "You're the branches, and I am divine." And there's maybe one chuckle in the audience, and just it falls flat. So Colbert jumps in. He's like, "Okay, wait a minute. You got 3 blind men, and they fall into a pit, and they need to describe the object in there. And so the first one says, well, I feel a spear. And the second one says, no, I feel a wall. And then the third one says, no, I feel a tree. Now, is it possible that Jesus is an elephant? And then he just goes to commercial break, and he says, thanks for being on the show, or something to that effect. And my friend showed me that clip, and we both laughed. We were both sympathetic. We were both in seminary at the time. And he says to me, my friend does, he says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I remember when he said that, I remember feeling both justified that Colbert pointed out something that was so obvious of a flaw in Ehrman's own reasoning, that he was oversimplifying things and just being controversial. And so I didn't really respect Ehrman that much. But at the same time, part of me, and it was probably a small part at the time, but part of me was like, well, why are we doing this whole enemy of my enemy is my friend thing? It's like, why do we have to keep doing this back and forth thing? But that's, it's part of human nature, it seems like. So what I want to point out is, while I was sympathetic to what Colbert was doing, and certainly to what my friend was saying, who, by the way, would have a different opinion on all this now, perhaps I'll have him on the podcast at some point, but what I want to point out is that once we engage in that, the conversation is sort of over. And it was for Colbert and Ehrman. It was like, okay, thanks for being on the show, get out. But only curiosity can help us to keep kicking that can down the road, can keep the conversation open, can build bridges from one opinion to the other. As soon as we sort of judge the person and, okay, you think I'm an idiot, well, I think you're an idiot, we've kind of removed any possibility to go further than that. And I don't think that's helpful. But of course, as you all know, that's kind of the way of society right now. You take a stance, you judge those who don't hold that stance, whether you use that wording or not, and then it's sort of conversation over. And a lot of people will even say things like, when they feel very strongly about something, they'll say, this is not a conversation. Well, like, how are we going to arrive at mutual understanding if it's not a conversation? So I think things might seem very clear to us, but judge not can get us places that we won't get otherwise. So I want to share something that might help as we think about this, whether you're convinced already or not. And that is this book by Perry Marshall, 80-20 Sales and Marketing. It takes the principle of 80-20 and applies it to sales and marketing, obviously. But in case you don't know what 80-20 is, what 80-20 is, many of you have heard of this. It's, 20% of the people do 80% of the work, that sort of thing. Well, the principle actually is much deeper than that. It goes back to a guy named Vilfredo Pareto, who was an Italian economist and sociologist. And in 1906, he showed that essentially 80% of Italian land was owned by 20% of Italians. And he showed this for different things and sort of made it into this economic principle. So there's the top 20%, and they're controlling 80%. Now, you probably are hearing that and you're thinking, well, that's very unfair. Well, yeah, it probably is. But this holds true today to a scary accurate degree. Now, there's, slight fluctuations, but it's always sort of around this 80-20. So 20% of the population owns 80% of the wealth. But it gets deeper than that even, because if you take that top 20, the top 20 of that are like scary rich. They just own way too much money. They have way too much power. And so there's an 80-20 within an 80-20. Within that 20, there's another 80-20. This applies to traffic on streets. If you look up a traffic map, an atlas or something, you see the highways, and some of those have tons of traffic, but then the other roads don't have as much. So 20% of the roads get 80% of the traffic. This goes for water and waterways, big rivers, small streams. This goes for football tickets. You know, Taylor Swift and her friends are always in the same spot in the Chiefs game. That's because they can afford the most expensive seats, whereas other people are just, you know, they scrape by their loose change and finally save up enough to go to their one Chiefs game in their lifetime. And so there's lots more people like that than there are people who are always sitting in the best seats at the football game. And so Perry Marshall put together this power curve, is what he calls it, to illustrate this principle. And I promise I'm going somewhere related to Judge Not with this. But this is what it looks like. You've got people over here who are, these people are, you know, the average person, and then the closer you get to 20%, the more it goes up, and then when you get to 1%, it's like, you know, this person is, or doesn't have to be a person, but can be various types of principles, could be, like I said, a river or a street or something, is getting much more than anyone else. Well, here's the reason I bring this up. When it comes to controversy, you might think this doesn't apply because there's like two polar opposites, and so there's not just one thing going on. And what Marshall noticed was an interesting thing happens, and the principle, in fact, does apply. So when you take something really controversial, so he takes Hillary Clinton's book, It Takes a Village, and he got on Amazon when the book was, I guess, relatively recently put out, and it had, at that point, 82 reviews, and it had 3 stars. Now, why would a book like that have 3 stars? Is it because it was just kind of like average? He says, no, no, no. When you get something that's really controversial, what you will see is immediately what you get on Amazon is a 3-star review, because you get, like in this case, 26 of those first reviews 5 stars, 27 1 stars, and practically nothing in between. You know, by comparison, there's just very little in between. And so you've got, what do you have? Well, he says you've got a 80-20 curve for it, an 80-20 curve against it, and you can combine the two, and you have some people really hate it, some people really love it, and that's the way controversial issues work. So another way to think of that is the people who are for it over here are also the people who are you know, over here on the against it. You know, they can hardly find anything wrong, and vice versa. So where does this get us in terms of Judge Not? Well, I'm still getting there, but stick with me. Okay, but let me go further in case you're not convinced of the principle. How did the 2024 election go? You ready for this? What's the U.S. population? Well, according to a Bing search, U.S. population is now 345,426,571. How many people voted for Trump? 77,237,942 of current counts. That is 22.36% of the population. How many people voted for Harris? 74,946,837. That's 21.697% of the population. So this is kind of scary accurate. Now you might say, well, not all of the population can vote, so it doesn't really apply because that number is a lot higher than 20%. But it actually, I think, kind of does, and it gets close enough because though not everyone can vote, a lot of people who voted one way or the other will tell you, like, yeah, like, I didn't really love this candidate, I just didn't like the alternative, so I voted this way. So the for and against curve definitely applies in the presidential election and has for the last several presidential elections. So in a polarized time or in a polarized topic, this will happen. So here's what that means for Judge Not. Here's where I'm going with this. Okay, most people in that curve, and for the election, let's say, that's 56% who didn't vote, one way or the other, or maybe they voted for a third candidate or something. Most people, that's the people here, most people, they're just tired of it. 20% of people feel very strongly one way, 20% of people feel very strongly the other way. But let's judge not, lest we be judged. Because if 20% of people felt very strongly one way, they probably had some good reasons to feel that way. Now, if you find yourself at one of these ends, you might not like what I just said, but what I'm also going to say is the 20% of people on the other side also had good reasons. That's why they are clinging so strongly to it, and that's why they can see so clearly the wrongs of the other side. So you might not agree with what I'm saying there, but I'm offering that 20% of people feel so strongly because they've got some good reasons, and 20% of people feel very strongly because they've got good reasons, and most people in between are like, yeah, I can see some of your things, but you're kind of holding on to this finger pointing, and I'm really tired of it. So that is what I'm offering is going on in this situation. So if we can agree on that, if we can agree that 20% have a point on something, and 20% over here have a point on something, and that there's more to talk about, and if we, unlike Ehrman and Colbert, if we come together and we actually have a cup of coffee together and don't kick each other off of our shows, then maybe we can get somewhere. Maybe it's like there's this episode of The West Wing where the president sits down with some Republicans. The president is a Democrat in that show, played by Martin Sheen, and he sits down with these guys and they don't like each other, and they're at this standoff, and he says, okay, so I think you're an idiot, and you think I'm evil. So let's just get that out of the way. And it's like until they do that and clear the air, they can't really have a conversation. But once they do, they can actually move forward, or they try to. And of course, the going is difficult. So speaking of politics, I always love to think about how Abraham Lincoln handled things like this. He, of course, was the president at one of the most polarized times, if not the most polarized times, in American history during the Civil War. And when he gave his second inaugural address, which was shortly before he died, he was assassinated, his speech was brilliant. It's one of his two speeches that are immortalized, carved into the Lincoln Memorial. And so in this speech, he said some very strong and clear things about the evils of slavery and slaveholding. But then he also manages to show that the whole nation was wrapped up in this great evil. And he says this, after he's taken his stance on slavery and its evils, he says, "But let us judge not, that we be not judged." And he says, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Lots of historians look back at Lincoln and they think, how would Reconstruction after the Civil War, how would it have gone if Lincoln hadn't died? Because every historian knows Reconstruction was very hard going. There were the radical Republicans who kind of founded their party and made their stand against slavery. Lincoln, of course, was a Republican, but he was not a radical Republican. The radical Republicans wanted to make the South pay. They could see quite clearly that there were evils of slavery, and so they wanted to make the South pay for that, and Lincoln out of the picture, they kind of got their way. And there's the Southern elites, a lot of the Democrats, they were sort of forced to pay, and as you can imagine, they became very bitter and resentful. They thought that a lot of the radical Republicans were oversimplifying a complex issue. They were taking away their way of life. Well, Maybe they had a point too, and even as I say this, as most of us very clearly see, including myself, the evils of slavery, it's hard to see how it was at all possible to see the merits of both sides and how hard it must have been for them to sit down in a room and talk these things out. Of course, in that case, it ultimately came to war, but Lincoln was very much a president that wanted to save the Union and preserve things and judge not. And that was a very hard road for him to take, but historians tend to agree that he was one of our best presidents, if not the best. So if he hadn't died, how would Reconstruction have gone? Probably would have gone a lot better. So rule number 2 of faith that seeks is judge not. Another way to put that would be to assume the best of everyone. Why do we judge not? Why is it important to judge not? Well, I want to just conclude with a couple of reasons for that. First, if we're honest with ourselves, we've all been wrong about some things, and if we've spent any amount of time, learning and trying to grow as people, we've probably been quite wrong about some things and had to change. But we wouldn't want to go back and be judged for where we used to be, because where we used to be, we used to see certain things clearly, and we'd probably had intentions of doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing, even with our flawed way of looking at things. So we wouldn't want to be judged for that, so should we judge people who we disagree with now? So that's one thing. Don't judge because we've all been wrong and we don't want to be judged. The second reason to judge not is because if we can let go of judgment, and if we can simply hear what other people are thinking and carry that dialogue forward, kick that can down the road, we can go interesting places. To judge not doesn't mean you lay down your values and your beliefs and all of that. To judge not simply means that you show up with curiosity and with your faith with you, and you have a conversation with someone. So, 2 rules of faith that seeks. Keep curiosity and faith together, and because ideas are personal, make sure to judge not.